Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. As you might be aware, January is Stalking Awareness Month. The Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, along with the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, would like to welcome you to this webinar, Stalking in Older Adults, an Overview. I'm Ann Lotch. I'm the Justice System Coordinator for the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. I've been with NCALL since 2016. In my role, I'm responsible for providing leadership within the criminal justice system on enhancing safety and the quality of life of older victims and survivors of abuse. I also provide training and technical assistance on justice system issues and create training materials and curricula on justice system responses to abuse in later life. In my past life as a legal services lawyer, I represented survivors of domestic and elder abuse and people with disabilities. I will let my co-presenter, Dana, introduce herself and tell you a little bit about SPARC.
Great, thanks so much, Ann, and thank you all again so much for spending some of your time today learning more about stalking and stalking in later life. My name is Dana Flightman. I am the Associate Advisor at SPARC, the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center. SPARC is a project of Equitas and is the Office of Violence Against Women technical assistance provider on stalking. We were just funded last year, so we're pretty new. Our website launched at the end of November, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to send you the link to it now. And we've been just getting up to speed, getting our website up, creating resources to help especially victim advocates and law enforcement as well as others better address stalking, help survivors, and hold offenders accountable. So in my role, it's a small staff on this project specifically. So I've been developing resources, providing training and technical assistance across the country, especially to campuses, victim advocates, and law enforcement. So I know I have a lot to say later, so I will stop there, stop talking about myself there. But yeah, thanks so much for joining. I look forward to speaking with you a little later. Oh, another me slide, I'm sorry. So the SPARC offers a lot of different resources to help you better address stalking and hold offenders accountable. We offer in-person trainings all across the country. We are funded to provide trainings to OVW grantees or potential grantees, so you can request those through our website. Webinars, as you're seeing now, like this, they can also be done more specifically on a subtopic, for example, technology and stalking. We can do webinars on that. We have online resources on our website, individual and organizational assistance. So if you're working on a stalking case and have a particular question or you're running into a particular problem, you know, what kind of technology might be being used, or we're having a really hard time prosecuting this case, or whatever it might be, please reach out to us and we can help. And if we can't, we can connect you to someone who can. Policy and protocol development. So especially for DV and sexual assault organizations, thinking about, you know, do you have a policy on serving victims of stalking? Does it serve all victims of stalking? If you can't serve all victims of stalking, how do you make referrals and who do you refer them to, so we can help you think through that? And National Stalking Awareness Month materials. And as Ann mentioned, January is National Stalking Awareness Month, which hopefully you all knew. And we are responsible for those materials. So NCALL and others have been wonderful about sharing those. They're available on our website. We have materials to share on social media, letters to the editor, posters, etc., some videos as well. So we still have a little more January left. So if you haven't already, I hope that you'll join me in spreading awareness this month and all year round on stalking.
Thanks, Dana. I will tell you a little bit about NCALL, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. I know lots of you have been on our webinars before. NCALL is the comprehensive technical assistance provider for Office on Violence Against Women, Abuse in Later Life, the grant program. Since 1999, NCALL has been the only national organization that provides technical assistance, training, and consultation on the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. NCALL is a national project. We have 8 staff, 2 folks who are working out of our home office in Madison, Wisconsin. We have staff in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where I am, northwestern Wisconsin, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. We do work in service of our mission in an array of areas and contexts related to abuse in later life. We do this work as a team and through various collaborations and partnerships, including our work with SPARC. We're both excited to talk to you guys today about older survivors and stalking. I want to thank Alicia and the folks at NCJ, FCJ for hosting this webinar and for making it possible for us to speak with you today. Our objectives for today's webinar are here on this slide. We hope that as a result of this session, you're going to be better able to recognize stalking behaviors, understand how stalking impacts older adults in particular, and also identify some resources to improve your own or your agency's response to stalking. The sort of overview of what we're going to be talking about is we'll do a brief overview of elder abuse, and then Dana's going to spend some time on the definition of stalking, prevalence of stalking dynamics, implications for the sort of intersection of stalking and older victims. What does that mean? What is unique about stalking among an older population? And then what are some resources that would be available to you and the organizations that you work for? So let's start out with a little review of what elder abuse is. In 2014, the Elder Justice field produced the Elder Justice Roadmap, which defined elder abuse as the physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, as well as neglect, abandonment, and financial exploitation of an older person by another person or entity. That can occur in any setting, home, in the community, or in a facility. And it can be either in a relationship where there is an expectation of trust, or when an older person is targeted based on their age or disability. So as you can imagine, in terms of statutory schemes across the country, local, state, federal law, tribal codes, there's not really a fixed definition of elder abuse. In addition, for those of you working within national or local organizations or agencies serving older survivors, your individual agency might have a particular definition or age limit that you assign to elder abuse. So that could be based on necessities of funding streams, internal policies and procedures, or any other factors that could impact your community's definition of elder abuse. For today, we really want to just recognize that in addition to statutory definitions, many of you may use other definitions of elder abuse in your work. Dana is going to talk in detail about the definition of stalking itself, but before she does, I want to share just a couple statistics to set the stage about what we're seeing around older adults and abuse in later life, to give you some context and to highlight the importance of focusing on older survivors. The first statistic you see here is from a national study that was done about 8 years ago. 1 in 10 older adults residing in the community reported experiencing abuse in the past year. And that number is striking because it only includes folks who had the economic, physical, and psychological resources to report that abuse was occurring to them. It means that they had a phone. It means that they were willing and able to pick up that phone or talk to a safe person, and they knew they needed to reach out for help. So this statistic does not include those older adults living in residential facilities, which is a significant number of people as well. And those folks may actually be more vulnerable to abuse in this population. It also does not include the huge numbers of people that we know are not willing or able to self-report abuse. So while the number is 1 in 10, in my mind, this is probably a big understatement of the scope and scale of the issue. A second statistic coming from the organization Lifespan in Rochester, New York, and also what we anecdotally see in our work at NCALL, is that elder abuse is significantly underreported. While we have no way of knowing for sure how many cases of elder abuse go unreported, a 2011 study by Lifespan found that in New York State, for every 1 case of elder abuse, which includes stalking, that came to the attention of a responsible entity, another 24 cases never came to light. And what this indicates, again, is a significant underestimation of the scope and scale of the issue. It also indicates the importance of being able to work effectively with older victims and of creating welcoming, accessible systems and responses that allow older victims access to healing and justice. So to really talk about the issue of victimization of older adults as it relates to stalking, I think there's no better place to start than by centering the voices of older victims themselves. We're going to start there. We're going to hear from a survivor named Velva. She was an 86-year-old stalking victim, and she talks about her experience with stalking and the difficulties that she had in reporting that abuse. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll refer back to it later as we see some of the barriers that stalking victims have to reporting their stalking. So we can go ahead and start the video.
All right, just before we hit play, I just wanted to remind everyone that the audio will only play over your computer speakers. So if you're listening to the phone right now, you can just mute your phone and turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio.
Over the course of 9 months, 86-year-old Velva Norenberg was stalked, but local law enforcement was not able to identify a pattern of stalking.
My house has been robbed and robbed and robbed. My things have been taken and moved. And he seemed to enjoy being in my house when I was there. He used his trusty screwdriver and pried out the lock. My back door looks like a beaver's intruded. After he quit breaking in, he'd just come in the yard and watch me through the window. Maybe rattle a doorknob before he left to let me know he was there. Until the last time he broke in, he tapped on the glass.
Law enforcement repeatedly responded to Velva's home for the robberies, but the items stolen were of little value.
Panty girdles, hand lotion. First he started in on the pantyhose and panty girdles. He took 3 panty girdles, and I'd say at least 15 or 20 pair of pantyhose.
That nothing of value was taken from Velva's house, that windows weren't broken, although the door jambs were just chewed up by the screwdriver. I think there was a discounting the impact of the crime, and Velva was very calm, and I think that her behavior was a bit different from what people expect from victims.
It's easy to not take it seriously, to say, oh, it's just pantyhose, it's a sort of a silly thing. The items taken were sexual in nature, and let's face it, we have a whole history of believing that the peeping Tom is something almost to be laughed at.
The phone calls Velva received, sometimes 10 or more in one day, were of a sexual nature as well.
He was always so in love with me he was coming over. Well, now, I definitely am not in love with some young man. I don't care how much he loves me. I didn't love him or had any intention of having anything to do with him, and I told him so. But he would call, oh, lady, you've got the most beautiful body.
I think her home became a far less safe place for her.
He asked me if I was still sexually active and how long since I'd had intercourse. I figured that was none of his business, and I didn't want to listen anymore, so I hung up.
It may be somewhat amusing to hear an 87-year-old woman say, he said he wanted to make love to me. But when you put that in context and you think about the man behind those words and the kind of danger that he could pose to anybody,
it makes you creepy. Your privacy is invaded. Somebody thinks he knows more about you than you do. I don't like that.
This defendant in 1983 had been convicted for assault with intent to rape with an elderly person in the same area.
Law enforcement response to the danger was delayed by the inability to recognize the calls and harassment as the felony crime of stalking. As is common, this was partly due to the fact that different officers responded each time.
It wasn't until the 9th response by law enforcement that somebody finally put it together that this was a pattern of behavior. Her age was against her. People tend to discount what an older woman is saying.
They didn't rush off. They were very polite and very nice. But as I say, it was an incident and it was over.
Really listen to your victim. Don't go into the situation with preconceived notions or some idea of a quick fix, because usually there isn't one. But your role as a law enforcement officer is so crucial in dealing with this problem.
I got a feeling that they really were trying to help me, but they helped me through the incident, but there was no follow-through. After several times, I even wrote a report and mailed it to the police department saying how many times I'd been entered, what had been taken.
And I think Velva's log that she kept every time there was an attempted break-in or phone calls or anything really was a visual representation that somebody could look at and say, this is a pattern of behavior. We're dealing with more than a single incident.
A young police officer handed me his card, and then he said, I think this should be turned over to some special division for investigation.
Although no one knew the stalker's identity, the police investigator tracked down a suspect who had been convicted of similar crimes in the past.
Great, thank you, Alicia. So a lot of what Velva experienced we're going to explore in greater detail during the course of this webinar, including how long it took her to get some assistance, not being believed, having her experiences minimized, that sort of thing. So we're going to have a poll now, and the poll platform is going to pop up. There it is. In your experience, have you ever worked with an older adult who is experiencing stalking? You can click yes or no if you want to vote. Okay. So about a quarter, it looks like a quarter of you or so have worked with somebody who is experiencing stalking. What we're going to, I'm going to hand the webinar off to Dana to talk about stalking in greater depth. Again, I guess it looks like about 30% of you have worked with an older adult who's experienced some stalking. As we go through the next section of the webinar, we hope that maybe some folks who may not think they have experience with a survivor of stalking in later life may be able to recognize that it is in fact something that occurs in the life of older adults, and maybe some of the behaviors and experiences that we think of as part of domestic violence or just part of elder abuse are in fact stalking behaviors. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Dana.
Great, thanks so much, Dan, and what a powerful video. So many stalking behavior examples that we'll see come up again and again, and I'll definitely be referring to that throughout the presentation. So thanks so much for sharing that with us and grounding that in that survivor's voice. It's really, really wonderful. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about stalking definition and dynamics. So when we talk about defining stalking, there's a legal definition and a behavioral definition. So as you might guess, similar to elder abuse that Ann talked about earlier, there's not one definition, one legal definition of stalking that everyone agrees on. Of course, different states, different jurisdictions have different definitions. At the federal level, there's a definition. Campuses have different definitions, etc. So we'll really focus on the behavioral definition today. But what I do want to point out is that one thing all the definitions agree on is that stalking is a crime. It is a crime in all 50 states at the federal level, in U.S. territories, the District of Columbia, tribal codes, and in the military justice system. So stalking is a crime. It can be a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the jurisdiction and the context and specifics of the incident or incidents. But it is something that is a crime, which is really essential because a lot of folks don't realize that it is illegal. And as you'll see throughout the webinar, it's really important to recognize because stalking actually has the potential to criminalize otherwise legal behaviors, but only when we understand stalking as a crime. So more on that later. So like I said, we'll focus mostly on the behavioral definition because that gives us a better sense of what stalking really is and how stalkers behave. So stalking is defined as a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So I know that's a little clunky, a lot of words in there. So I've highlighted some of the big concepts and I'm going to break them down for you now. So pattern of behavior, let's start there. So stalking is not a single incident or a one-off event. Often the word stalking is misused and people might use it to describe like a peeping Tom. But someone who's just, not just, and I'm not trying to minimize that crime, but someone who is randomly looking into a locker room, for example, is not necessarily a stalker, especially if they only do that one time. It is targeted at a specific person, and it's something that happens more than once. Depending on your state statute, it might be 2 times, it might be 3 times. Most say it's 2 or more times. And it's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me kind of use those terms interchangeably, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm really talking about the same thing, which is that stalking pattern of behavior. And it can include a wide variety of behaviors. So some of those behaviors are legal outside of the context of a stalking case, and some of them aren't. So, for example, if I was stalking Anne, and Monday I just text her all day, and then Tuesday I get mad, she doesn't text me back, I smash her windows. Then Wednesday I feel bad, I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors that could be part of a pattern of behavior. Even though texting and sending a gift, those things are illegal on their own, but they can become criminal as part of a stalking course of conduct. And others are criminal on their own. So that property damage, vandalism, robbery, which we heard about with Velva, those are illegal on their own. But we want to take a step back from just things that are crimes on their own and look at the full scope and the full pattern of behavior of a stalking situation and realize that even these otherwise legal behaviors can become illegal as part of stalking. And as you can imagine, that's very confusing often for victims and survivors because they're saying, okay, well, this guy rang my doorbell. What am I going to do, call the police, right? The answer is, well, yes. And we all need to, as victim advocates and law enforcement, recognize that this is a crime, even when made up of individual acts that are not on their own criminal. So it is a pattern of behavior. Stalking is directed at a specific person. That being said, we do often see what we call target dispersion, which is perhaps a stalker is stalking their former partner, and then that partner starts dating someone new. So now the stalker is stalking the former partner as well as the new significant other that person is seeing. And so a stalker may also contact the victim's family, friends, coworkers, etc. So certainly other people can become stalked and become involved in the stalking situation, but it's typically in the context of and purpose of stalking that one targeted individual. So like with Velva's story, there might have been multiple victims at different times, but that man was definitely targeting just her. He wasn't just hanging out in her neighborhood with whoever happened to go by. It was directed at a specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really essential to the definition of stalking, and it's actually what differentiates stalking from a crime it's often confused with, which is harassment. So the difference is that harassment is generally repeated behavior that's irritating. It would make someone feel angry or annoyed. And harassment can be very serious. I'm not trying to minimize that crime at all. But the difference is, for example, if I was harassing Anne, I'm just being really mean to Anne today on this webinar, I might text her and on this webinar, maybe I'm just being really annoying to her. I'm making insulting comments to her about her contributions to the webinar for some reason. I'm texting her because she gave me her work number, her personal number in case of emergency, and I'm misusing it and asking her a bunch of questions about the webinar platform. That might be harassment, and it could be really annoying and insulting to her. But if I then started showing up where Anne lives, sending Anne pictures of herself she didn't know were taken, now that's scary, right? Anne's like, oh my God, what is Dana doing? What is she going to do next? It's scary now. So that's when it changes from harassment to stalking. Harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct, or something can start as harassment and become stalking, but that's generally the difference. And I think it's important to parse that out, because often they're used interchangeably and they're not exactly the same thing. So that fear element's really, really important. But that's tough, right? Because fear is subjective. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. People are afraid of different things. And that's why the context is so critical in a stalking case. So, for example, there was this one case where this woman called the police, and she was hysterical, just so upset, and all she would say to them was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." And so the police, understandably, are not exactly rushing to the scene of the crime. They're kind of like, what's the big deal? So you prefer tea? I mean, what's going on here? And eventually she calmed down enough to say, "He's here." It turned out this was a stalking victim who had been stalked by an abusive ex-boyfriend. And she had moved across the country, was part of an address confidentiality program, did not believe that he had any idea where she was. She left to go to work that morning, gets in her car, and she sees a cup of coffee with his nickname for her on it. Ooh, so I can't hear you because we're on a webinar, but I'd imagine you just made like, ugh, kind of sound internally or externally, because it's creepy, right? That's scary. That would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. But without knowing the context, we don't understand, because just a cup of coffee in the car, that's not scary to an outsider. So context is really critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases. Something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you as the person responding. Whether you're responding as a friend, law enforcement, victim advocate, you might need to really ask the victim, what about that was scary to you? What did that mean to you? Because stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. So, for example, stalker who says, "I'll send you roses the day I kill you," and then the stalking victim receives roses that day, will be terrified. But to an outsider, it might seem benign or even nice. "Oh, someone sent you roses, how nice," right? But that specific meaning is only understood. And it, like I said before, it criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. So it's really that context of stalking that is so essential to understand. Fear is also tricky because it's often masked by other emotions like frustration, or I'm sure you've worked with a victim who's just really angry, right? They don't seem afraid, they seem angry. Or they might show no affect because they're minimizing what's going on or be minimizing what's going on. So, for example, my colleague Jen Landheis was a victim advocate for years, and she was a victim of stalking once who he had cut the stalking victim's landline, and she came to the police station, the victim, and said, you know, "He cut my landline, he threatened to kill me." And so victim advocate's waiting with the victim, the police go out to respond to the crime. And so while the victim advocate and victim are sitting waiting, the victim says, "Oh, do you think they'll take his gun away?" And the victim advocate, Jen, was like, "What gun?" And the victim said, "Oh, well, when he threatened to kill me, he held a gun to my head." And so the victim advocate made sure the responding officers knew that that was the case, because, you know, they want to know that kind of thing when they respond to an incident. And then she asked the victim, "You know, I'm curious, why didn't you mention that there was a gun?" And the victim said, "Well, he does that to me all the time. He never actually killed me." So again, I can't hear or see your reaction, but typically when I can, people give that kind of same, ugh, kind of, oh, that's scary, right? As reasonable people, which I'm assuming all the listeners on this webinar are, that would cause us to feel fear. So we're not saying that the victims or survivors are unreasonable. It's just that they may be minimizing their experiences because of all the trauma that is happening through the stalking case. What would cause a reasonable person's fear may now seem really normal to them. And so that reasonable person standard is actually really helpful in the definition of stalking, because something may still be stalking even if the person isn't coming out and saying, "I'm afraid." It's really up to us to read between the lines, right? Ooh, I'm sorry. Skipped ahead there. It's up to us to read between the lines, because a stalking victim's not going to come to you and say, you know, "Hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking," right? They're not going to say that. They're going to say, "My ex has gotten creepy, my cousin's being weird, my neighbor's freaking me out." And it's really up to us to have that stalking lens on and to think about, could this be stalking? What else is going on here? Another thing is a lot of folks don't like to admit when they're afraid, just in general. In our society, that can be kind of frowned upon. But it can be really helpful to ask the victim what behaviors they've changed in response to the stalking. So if they're saying, oh, I'm not afraid, but I changed my routes to and from my home and from my classes, and I don't see my family on the same days anymore, and I screen all my calls now. Okay, that's not just that you're kind of annoyed with someone. To me, that demonstrates a kind of fear. So there are ways to get at, to demonstrate that fear, to think about, could this be fear and could this be stalking? So stalking is an extremely prevalent crime, and in a one-year period in the United States, around 7.5 million people are stalked, and that breaks down to about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men. And a side note about this data, this is from the NISBS data, which uses a very strong definition of stalking, where the respondent had to say that they were stalked in a way that made them feel very fearful that they or someone close to them would be harmed. So it's actually a really high threshold for stalking, right? And we're still seeing 1 in 6 women saying, yes, I've experienced that. In the next iteration of the data, they're actually going to take out that very fearful, and when they piloted that in smaller groups, the rates are more like 1 in 4 women. And so we think we're going to see the prevalence go up the next round of data, not as a result of there necessarily being more stalking, but because more of the stalking that's going on might be captured. So if you think about that data, about 1 in 4 women, it's really, or even 1 in 6 women, to use this more conservative data, it's quite similar to the prevalence of sexual assault, which is around 1 in 5 women, or domestic violence, which is about 1 in 4 women. And under the Violence Against Women Act, stalking is one of the 4 crimes that we're charged with addressing, and yet it's one that we do not discuss in our field very much at all. Often in in-person trainings, I'll ask folks to raise their hand if this is the first time they've had the opportunity to attend a training on stalking, and usually at least half the room that's the case for, though we've all seen the power and control wheel a lot of times. So don't worry, it's coming later in this presentation, so nothing against it. But it is something that we don't really discuss or necessarily address to the level that we address those other crimes within our movement. So just something to think about how important it is. While people of all gender identities can be perpetrators or victims of stalking, the majority of stalkers in the data asks the victims to identify if their stalkers are male or female. And the vast majority identified their stalkers as male, including over 80% of stalkers over age 60 were identified as male. And women are much more likely than men to experience stalking, and this is true in the older adult population as well. Again, people of all gender identities can be stalked. We just don't have great data on stalking in same-sex relationships or in the LGBT community. Stalking is quite understudied. So from small studies and talking to victim advocates on the ground, it seems the rates might be even higher in the LGBT population, similar to how they are for domestic and sexual violence, but we just don't have the data to present. But I want to call that out because we're not trying to ignore that population or talk about this in an overly binary way. We're just quoting the best available research that exists, and this is how it differentiated the data. So when I look up stalking on Google, which is like I do, Google Images, these are the kind of pictures I get. And there's a lot of masked men in hoodies lurking in the background. My favorite's this guy who's got a mask on and a hoodie and is on a computer, sometimes with binoculars, so you get that idea of that kind of dark, shadowy stranger in the alley or kind of a hacker or something like that. And while there are stranger stalkers, it probably won't surprise most of you to know that the vast majority of the time the victim knows the perpetrator. And I'm sure you're not surprised by that as folks in the field, but when I'm talking about stalking outside the field, because I'm fun to hang out with at parties and stuff, people are often surprised because they think right to celebrity stalkers, and that in the general public, our understanding of stalking is very much about celebrities and strangers and kind of random people who become infatuated. And again, that can happen, but that's really not the majority of stalking cases, and that can become another barrier to reporting because it's similar to sexual assault. People are like, well, it's not stalking because I know him or her, right? But of course it is. About half the time overall, the victim and the perpetrator is a current or former intimate partner, so like a husband or boyfriend or something like that. So that's true about 43% of the time for male victims and over 60% of the time for female victims. So that is a very significant piece of it, is that intimate partner stalking. And intimate partner stalkers are also tend to be our most dangerous stalkers, which we'll talk about more in a second. But what I want to call out here that's really important is that if about half of stalking situations are intimate partner, that means about half are not intimate partner. They're acquaintances, strangers, family members, people of authority. And so we want to think about in your services, are you able to serve all victims of stalking, even if the victim is not experiencing stalking from a current or former intimate partner? And if you are, which is awesome, would they know to come to your service? Because something called, for example, family crisis services, well, if I'm being stalked by my neighbor, I'm unlikely to think that, calling the family domestic violence hotline is going to help me, right? So how are you reaching those folks? And if you're not able to serve them because of whatever restrictions are on your agency, where do those folks go? Because typically our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of these cases do relate to domestic violence, but it's also not a complete picture because about half of them are not domestic violence related at all. And so working with victims of stalking, whether they're older adults or really across the entire age spectrum, we want to think about if we're able to really serve everyone and cast a wide net there. So people can be stalked throughout the entire age spectrum, and this is, I know there's many stories about children being stalked all the way up to older adults. So about 15% of those who are stalked are over the age of 50 overall. And just a few recent kind of ripped from the headlines to demonstrate that stalking certainly does happen to older adults from a variety of sources and can often co-occur with other crimes, which we'll talk about more in a second. So stalking behaviors, and we saw some really great examples of these in the video about Velva as well. There's so many different behaviors that stalkers might use to stalk, and stalkers are extremely creative criminals. I read stalking news every day, and it's just mind-boggling, the bizarre things that stalkers will do to terrify their victims. They're extremely creative. This is some wonderful research by Logan and Walker in which they differentiated 4 categories of stalking behaviors. Of course, many of them overlap, but I want to give you just a few examples of them to get kind of the breadth of what a stalker may do to scare their victims. So the acronym is SLI: surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation. So surveillance could include watching, tracking through GPS or other technology. Life invasion is kind of how does that person showing up in the victim's life where he or she does not want them to be there. So, for example, just showing up at work. Velva talked about, they take things from her home, but they weren't expensive things. And that's something we actually hear a lot from stalking victims, that they'll say, I know the stalker was in my home, but they didn't take anything at all. They just turned the TV on or they moved something around. And so you can imagine it's really intimidating and it feels very invasive to know someone was in your home or in your car, but there is no crime committed. And so they're thinking, well, can I call the police because they turned the lamp on? But it's very invasive. It might also spread rumors about the victim. But that can be done through just print flyers or through social media, impersonate them through different social media accounts or things like that. So there's so many ways that they can invade their life and really just show up where the victim does not want that stalker to be. Interference is related to life invasion, and it's kind of what is the stalker taking away from the victim, or what is the victim afraid of losing or actually losing as a result of that stalking. So, for example, stalkers may hack accounts and interfere with their finances, sign them up for things they never wanted to be signed up for, drop them for things they don't want to be dropped from. They could contact their colleagues at work or their family and spread rumors about them. So kind of keeping them, and a lot of stalking victims move as a result of their victimization to avoid that stalker. So it can be a huge interference in their life. And then intimidation, so threats, whether explicit, like I'm going to hurt you, or implicit. So it's certainly very threatening for someone to be in your apartment or to remove the lock from your door like they did in that case with Velva. So all different kinds of intimidation. And of course, many of these overlap and co-occur, and stalkers usually use multiple tactics. It's important to think about the wide range of different tactics that a stalker might use, because we tend to be kind of incident-based in both law enforcement as well as with victim advocates sometimes, because we're busy and someone comes in complaining about a certain situation and we respond to that one situation. And in the video, I took a note because I was like, yes, Velma, you're so right. She talked about, the law enforcement really helped her with that incident, but it wasn't about the entire case and everything that was going on. And when we're safety planning, we want to think about, so what has the stalker done and what might they do next? Because stalkers, again, are creative and they usually use multiple means. They engage in multiple behaviors to stalk their victims. So if a victim's coming in and saying, I'm receiving all these phone calls, we want a safety plan around that, and then say, here's some other things that might happen. If X happens, then maybe we could do Y, right? And really think through all the whole range of stalking behaviors that a stalking victim might experience. The most common stalking behaviors are unwanted phone calls and messages, followed by spreading rumors, following or spying. And like I said, most stalking victims experience multiple behaviors at once. 78% of stalkers use more than one means of approach, so they're not just calling or just showing up. They're doing a variety of different things. 2/3 pursue their victim at least once per week. Some pursue daily, many pursue daily. So it's something that is chronic and ongoing. And about 1 in 5 use weapons to threaten or harm victims. Stalking changes over time, and the average duration of a stalking case, not the high end, the average, this really shocked me when I heard it, is 2 years. So stalkers have plenty of time to start with phone calls and then, back off for a month, then get back into it and show up in person and spread rumors and make a fake account. So it really can be very dynamic, change over time. The frequency might change, the intensity might change, and they don't all last that long, of course, but it can last a very, very long time. Unsurprisingly, stalking victims experience a lot of serious impacts. Many experience serious mental health issues, depression, anxiety, insomnia, social dysfunction. About 1 in 8 lose time from work. More than half lose 5 days or more. And 1 in 7 stalking victims move, relocating often at their own expense, uprooting their families just to get away from that stalker. So it can be something really invasive that has a huge impact on somebody's life. And here's a quote from a survivor of stalking that I think would be really helpful to hear from survivors. She said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." So really that lifelong impact. And I want to pause here and acknowledge that stalking often co-occurs with physical violence or predicts physical violence, which is important, and we'll talk about that. But it's also, even when it doesn't, on its own, a really psychologically damaging and terrible crime, just on its own, that can have severe and lifelong impacts on victims and survivors. So why? Why do they stalk? I get this question a lot, and there's no great answer, similar to the question of why do abusers abuse, right? There's different profiles, there's different people in different fields have created different answers to that question, but there's no real consensus. And it's the same with stalking. Sometimes we see what we call stalker typologies. If you Google them, you can find them, and they'll talk about like the rejected stalker or the obsessional stalker. At SPARC, we're a little critical of those because we don't want to overly categorize stalkers because often their motives vary, their motives can be conflated, and also we don't want to say, well, this is the obsessional stalker and they'll act like this and here's what they'll do and here's what they won't do, because the truth is that stalkers can be unpredictable and their behaviors can escalate at any time. That being said, there are some common motives that we found to share because stalking is such a bizarre crime that it often begs the question, why are they doing this? So we don't have a complete answer, but here's some of the answers we found. The stalker might be seeking affection, trying to establish a relationship. It could be power and control, an extension of power and control, from an intimate partner relationship. Of course, you're all familiar with that from domestic violence context. Rejection, so sometimes to punish the person who rejected them or to try to win them back, or some confusion between the two, the person will begin to stalk them. Obsession, they might be planning to commit a crime. We'll talk more about that in a second. And a lot of it just because they can, because stalking, it's rarely charged, it's rarely prosecuted, and a lot of times stalkers get away with it. So I really appreciate you being on this webinar to help change that reality and make it something that, no, they can't do. They can't just get away with, because right now it's something that a lot of them know they can do, so they do it. All right. I'm going to turn it back to Anne here for co-occurrence with other crimes.
Thank you, Dana. It was such great information. Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, and I feel like it's really timely right now. Before the webinar started, Dana and I were talking about the Netflix series called You. I don't know if any of you guys have watched it yet, but stalking is at the center of it, and there are a couple things in the material today that made me think of that. So I'll bring it up later, but we want to talk now about the co-occurrence of stalking with other crimes. It does often, as Dana mentioned, co-occur with other crimes. Stalkers have a very high recidivism rate, and they frequently violate orders of protection. So unfortunately, stalking, because as Dana explained, it can be comprised of acts that are not in themselves criminal, it's often not identified until one of these other crimes is committed as well. Stalking crimes often increase in severity over time, as if the perpetrator is sort of testing the waters to see what they can get away with. Like, if I can try that, maybe next time I'll try something that's a little more extreme. They may start with something small like trespassing or theft and then work up to something much more threatening or violent. So here you can see some of the common crimes that often accompany stalking. And here we know that among stalking cases, these are some of the specific statistics related to the intersection of stalking and other crimes. 24% of stalking crimes, like we saw in Velva's case, involve property damage. 21% involve a direct attack on the victim. 15% involve an attack on another person or a pet. Additionally, identity theft, crimes against property, it can also be common, but identity theft is something that we frequently see. A stalker who's charging something to a victim's credit cards, who's taking money from their bank accounts, or who has opened or closed accounts in their name.
I just want to jump in really, can I just jump in really quickly on the identity theft and the financial piece? Something to consider is often we think right to like, oh, it must be some sophisticated hacker kind of thing, and it can be, but really if you just think about password safety and security, so if you're like me, you know you should have a different password for everything, but you don't, and when you forget your password, which I always do, you know, it asks you, I'll admit to, you know, the bank, I forgot my password, and then it asks me security questions, and the questions are things like, what's your mother's maiden name, or where did you go to high school? And we tend to answer those truthfully because we want to remember them. But someone else also probably knows that information, and that's the stalker, especially if it was a former intimate partner, but even just, or a family member. But there's a variety of different kinds of stalkers who either already know that or can gain access to that information and simply get into an account, reset it, and then withdraw finances or do a variety of other things. So I'll send a link in a second to NAED has a really wonderful resource called Safety Net that gives some advice around password safety and other things like that. On those in particular, sometimes we suggest that victims answer the questions. So instead of actually writing the true answer to the question, write like a song lyric they like or their favorite color or something they'll remember, but it isn't the truthful answer to the question. But sort of point out there's a lot of sophisticated stalking through technology, but there's also just some of those recovery tools or things we may not think too much about that can be misused by a stalker to gain access. So, and we know it's so common in stalking cases, and while I don't have the data to back this up, I would venture, especially with older adults who are often the target of other kinds of financial scams. So just something to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. No, good advice. So let's move into talking a little bit about stalking and intimate partner violence. Here it is. Dana mentioned we're going to get into the power and control wheel a little bit. I expect that you are all familiar with this. But for those who may not be, this wheel illustrates the concept that relationship violence is a combination of different tactics that are used to maintain power and control. Think of the wheel as a diagram of the tactics that your abusive partner uses to keep you in the relationship. While the inside of the wheel is comprised of subtle, continual behaviors, the outer ring represents physical, visible violence. These are the abusive acts that are more overt and more forceful, and often the intense acts that reinforce the regular use of other subtler, more subtle methods of abuse. So when you think about the behaviors we typically talk about as the emotional abuse aspect of domestic violence, like surveillance, like following somebody, texting them all the time, realize that in many cases what we're talking about is we're actually talking about stalking. In our field, we often don't talk about stalking until after someone leaves a relationship, as in, you know, he was abusive, and then when she left him, he started to stalk her because he wanted her back. But we don't realize that stalking is often happening during the relationship as well. It's important to name because it helps describe the actual behavior. It requires, as Dana alluded to, different kinds of safety planning, and it also has the opportunity to criminalize behavior that would otherwise be legal. Did you want to add anything on the wheel, Dana?
No, I think you covered it. That's great.
Right. Let's talk about the point in the relationship where stalking might occur. This is a slide that made me think of the Netflix show as well, because we think of, you know, typically when people think about stalking, as I said, it's in the context of an ex-intimate partner. But in the Netflix show, it's somebody who was a future intimate partner, and the stalking continued during the course of the relationship. So here you can see that stalking might occur during an abusive relationship, or it may begin after the relationship has ended. But we see here that in 57% of the cases, it is happening during the relationship as well. So don't think of it as something that is only happening after a relationship ends. Research has also shown that stalking by a current or former intimate partner can be especially dangerous to its targets. A stalker who is a former intimate partner is much more likely to physically approach the victim. They're more likely to be insulting or threatening, interfering with daily aspects of their life, like Dana talked about. They're much more likely to use weapons. Their behaviors are more likely to escalate. They're more likely to assault a third party in the context of that stalking. And as we mentioned earlier, they're much more likely to reoffend. Stalking by an intimate partner is also much more lethal. In 76% of cases where a woman was murdered by an intimate partner, there was at least one episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder. In attempted murders, that rate is even higher. There was at least one episode of stalking within the year prior to the attempted murder in 85% of those cases. So you can see that the lethality risk is much greater. Back over to you, Dana.
All right, great. Thank you. So also talk a little bit about the co-occurrence of stalking and sexual violence. So stalking can intersect with sexual violence in a few ways. A stalker may threaten to sexually assault the victim just as part of their intimidating behavior. They may actually sexually assault the victim, or they might attempt to get someone else to sexually assault the victim. So that third one I know is a little strange, so let me explain what that might look like. So example, in this case, this man posted at least 165 ads in the Craigslist casual encounter section posing as his ex-girlfriend and saying that she had a rape fantasy and wanted a man to come over, and because we live in a terrible world, many men came to her home. I believe in this specific case, the woman was not actually assaulted, but I wish I could say this was a strange case, that this is a very uniquely creative criminal, but actually we're seeing more and more of this using either Craigslist or creating fake online dating profiles where especially ex-partners, though it could be anyone, says that they poses as the victim and says that they want someone to have sex with them, and that if you react in a scared way, that's just part of the rape fantasy or what have you. And then those victims have actually been sexually assaulted. So in this case, Ken Skepen was he was prosecuted for this, even though he didn't commit an assault, for trying to facilitate an assault. And the other case I'm thinking about right now, this ex-Marine, he also got jail time for facilitating and kind of setting up the sexual assault that ultimately took place, even though he himself did not commit the assault. So like I said, stalkers, and I keep saying it, so sorry, you're probably sick of me saying it, but stalkers are creative criminals. I wish I could say this was this weird off-the-wall case, but actually we're seeing more and more cases like this where sexual assault intersects with stalking. And yet folks aren't always thinking of this as stalking and charging it as stalking. But again, it's a pattern of behavior. He's posting 165 ads. It's targeted at that specific individual, and it would certainly cause a reasonable person to feel fear, right? So this can be part of a stalking course of conduct for sure. Another thing to think about is grooming for sexual assault as stalking. So some of you may be familiar with this LESIC research, and this was for college campuses specifically. So you may be thinking, why are we talking about this on this webinar about older adults? And hopefully I will be able to convince you that it's relevant. I'll talk about it more in a second. But in this very influential research, LESIC found that about 6% of men met the criteria for committing attempted or completed rape, and these were repeat perpetrators who averaged about 6 rapes per person. So this doesn't capture all sexual assault on campus, but there's a certain kind of perpetrator who has a very specific MO and is committing sexual assault on campus, and they do this a few different ways, or they have a process for doing this. So he found that they chose their targets intentionally. They often identified vulnerable young women. They often focused on freshmen. They would contact them multiple times to assess their vulnerability, talk them up, invite them to the party, etc. Once they arrived at the party, they would ply them with alcohol. They controlled the alcohol, gave them strong drinks, and then isolate that victim. And they often took them to rooms that were specifically set up for the purpose of sexually assaulting that victim. Then after the assault took place, they would contact the victim. They might say anything from, thanks for a great time, to you better keep your mouth shut, to going back and forth between the two, or anything in between. And that's how these sexual assault perpetrators operated. So if you think about that, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes, it is a pattern. They are doing this deliberately. It involves multiple contexts. It is targeted at a specific person that they are targeting because of their vulnerability, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. You might think, well, when though? Because a freshman girl might say, a freshman young woman might say, you know, I wasn't afraid when this attractive senior first started talking to me, but now that I realized the entire thing was a setup for my sexual assault, now I feel afraid, right? So there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So this can still be considered a stalking case, even if fear attaches later. So the reason I think it's interesting to have the stalking lens on when we think about sexual assault, which is often hard to prove and prosecute, because often sexual assault perpetrators are more likely to admit, oh yeah, I really liked her, so I called her, and here's all our text messages, not realizing you might be thinking of a stalking charge. And while I don't have a study to back this up, you can imagine that for elderly adults who are also often targeted because of their perceived vulnerability, a perpetrator might be doing the same kind of thing, stalking someone to figure out, does this older person live alone? What is the security like if they're in a community where they live with other older people? Who do I need to talk to get in there? When are they alone? What are their disabilities? What are their needs? To really target them to commit possibly sexual assault or another crime like robbery or something of that nature. And that when we're looking at these other crimes, there's so many crimes that can co-occur with stalking that we take a step back and say, okay, it might be sexual assault, it might be robbery, it might be vandalism, it might be another kind of elder abuse. Could it be that and stalking? And think again through that stalking lens, like I'm demonstrating here for thinking about sexual assault in this research. We'll talk briefly about the use of technology to stalk. This is its own entire topic, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it in more detail and go through the different kinds of technology. But I just wanted to call it out because it is such an important thing to recognize that technology can be used to engage in stalking behavior. And to remember that older adults use technology. So sometimes we might assume that they don't, or that they're not up with the trends or they don't have it, but at this point 80% of seniors own cell phones, 40% own smartphones, the majority use the internet, and about a third use social media. And of course we're painting seniors here with a very broad brush, and younger seniors have higher rates of technology use than older seniors. So all of those technology issues that can come up with stalking can certainly impact older adults as well as younger adults. Sometimes we think right to, oh, the teens and the millennials and their technology, but it can really be across the board something that's used or rather misused to facilitate stalking behavior. There's so many different ways that technology can be used or rather misused to stalk. And again, we don't have time to really go into depth on this, but just to kind of give you an idea of the range. Certainly phones can be used for calls, messages, text, to send pictures, to take video. Cameras have been around a long time, but they're becoming cheaper and easier to use. GPS is also something that's become integrated in more devices to help track someone. So what's very popular on the market right now are like child trackers or pet trackers, and the idea is you want to make sure that your dog doesn't get lost, so you put a little device on their collar, and then on your phone you can see where your dog is, which is great, except that we found them also on the bottom of stalking victims' cars, et cetera, because there's really nothing to guarantee that the technology will only be used in that intended way. And so there's a lot more GPS and smart devices out there that can be misused in that way. Spyware, so deliberately installing something on someone's computer or their cell phone that actually captures and shows you all of their texts and Snapchats and conversations, and assistive technologies, especially relevant for this population, that can be used to stalk if they're monitored, how they're used, etc. So how do you know if a stalker might be using technology? Of course, it depends what the stalker is doing and what that technology is, right? But some of the major red flags, if the stalker knows where the victim is, and it doesn't make sense how they would know where that victim is, it's possible that there's GPS or something else going on there technologically. If they have access to information the victim never shared with him or her, so if the victim's saying, well, I just texted that to my daughter, and somehow the stalker knew, but that's the only thing that's the only person I told, okay, well that might imply that perhaps there is some kind of spyware or something going on where the stalker is intercepting that message. And certainly if the victim's locked out of account, their passwords have changed, they can't get in where they used to be able to get in or whatever, all of that could be a sign that technology is being misused to stalk. So I really suggest that you, and I shared the website, check out techsafetyapp.org. It's a wonderful resource by NMEDV that gives a lot of really concrete strategies for improving safety on technology, as well as talking about different devices and how they can be misused and what might be going on. And again, I'm happy to. Feel free to request a training and can talk about it in more detail. But because technology is so prevalent in stalking cases, I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that it can be used here. So we're mostly focusing on older adults here as victims of stalking, but older adults can be stalkers as well, right? People of all age groups are victims of stalking as well as perpetrators of stalking. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about older adult stalkers. And here's just a few examples from recent headlines of elderly people who are stalking people of different age groups. So a 22-year-old tried to pay to give an ex stitches. That was an ex that was around his same age. And so there are, older adults who are stalkers, and there are older adults who are stalked. So a note about this research, actually all the research I'm talking about in this presentation about older stalkers specifically is coming from this one study on stalking and age. So I want to point that out because it's a great study, but it's just one study. The stalking in general is really understudied, and when you try to study stalking among any specific population, like I saw someone ask about LGBT, among older adults, there's even less information available. So this is really the study that I found that was comparing stalking among different age groups. So I still think it has some helpful insights to teach us, but I do want to just highlight that this is not, this is just one study and what it is saying. So according to one study, older stalkers are more likely to stalk acquaintances and strangers than intimates, which, as you might recall from that earlier chart, which talks about stalking overall, is a little bit unique because typically the relationship is more likely to be intimate and acquaintances, but here over half are actually stalking acquaintances. And there's 24% strangers, which is higher than in the general population. So that's just something to think about, that older stalkers might be targeting people a little bit differently with some slightly different relationships than in the general population. They defined older stalkers to age 60 plus in this study, just to call that out. So they were least likely to target same-sex victims, and they were the most likely to actually injure victims, which I thought was interesting. And importantly, they were more likely than those in other age groups. They had a young and a middle age group to target people of their own, to target people outside of their own age group, excuse me, like younger acquaintances. So that's just something to think about, that again, stalking and older adults, they can be stalkers, they can be the stalked. And this was a study of, it had 1,600 respondents overall, and everyone here was 60 plus. Sorry, I just had a note to say that because I wanted to be true to the research going on. And they were in the UK, the US, and Australia. So anyways, again, just one study, but that stalking, there's a suggestion here that stalking in older adults might look a little bit different than in the general population. So we're working with victims with stalking. It could be someone younger, someone their own age, etc. Okay, and I'll hand it back to Anne here.
Thanks, Dana. Let's talk a little bit about reporting and responding to stalking among older victims. And we're going to start off with a poll. You can just type your feedback into the chat box on the webinar platform. We know that fewer than half of stalking victims report to the police. Why might older victims be hesitant to report? Or if they're not hesitant, what barriers might they face to reporting? I'll give you guys a minute to sort of type your thoughts into the chat box. But we know, what might be some of the reasons that an older victim would not report that stalking was happening in their life. So one of the responses was memory issues or dementia. People already think that they're living in a separate reality and they're not, that's not really happening. I think that is the most common reason, right? People fear they're not going to be believed, or they're just not believed, like we saw in Velva's case. Shame is a good one, fear of retaliation, not recognizing that what is happening is actually stalking is terrific. Again, fear and embarrassment, fear of not being believed. Good feedback. So a lot of you guys already mentioned these sorts of things. I'll just highlight some of the things that didn't come up. Ooh, this is a good one. Elders may not be familiar with the laws. They might not know that what's happening is a crime and that they are the victim of a crime, and they just think, well, this is just how it is. Or they think that they can stop it themselves. That's good. So just to highlight a couple, obviously older adults face a baseline of issue of ageism around when it comes to older victims. The amount and the opportunity for older adults and harmful stereotypes, we respond to older victims and often they're the victim of stereotypes about their capacity and about characteristics of what their lives might be like. Whether it's about abusers who are stalkers, sometimes I think one of the dynamics is people think, well, that can't be happening to her. Who would want to stalk an older victim? We heard Velva talk about that in the video. Some older adults, as many of you pointed out, might experience assumptions minimizing the threat against an older adult, like we saw in Velva's case. Are they confused? You know, she doesn't always know what's really going on, so that can't be happening to her. I think that's probably the most common misconception. So those are some of the reasons folks might not be willing to report. If they've got confusion around technology, we know that most older adults are using smartphones, are using technology, but some of the technology that can be used to stalk them might be beyond anything they're familiar with. I know it's certainly beyond things that that could be another reason that people are not reporting. So we can see here, you know, what happens when people do report, and these sorts of stereotypes are part of the response to them. 7% of older victims were told that they're just overreacting, that really this is nothing to worry about. 2/3 of older victims were not taken seriously by the police. You heard in Velva's case how many times she had to talk to the police before somebody actually did something. Unfortunately, that is a pretty common experience. So when victims of stalking in general do seek support and assistance when they're dealing with stalking, we see that a plurality of victims seek support from family and friends, also from folks like employers or an attorney, the justice system, as well as mental health professionals, a doctor, a nurse, a faith leader, and other community-based advocates like yourselves. These statistics are helpful in that they can provide us with an indicator of how you can think about effective ways to assist older victims of stalking. If victims are coming to you, that's great. If they're not, could you be collaborating either through formal networks or informally to ensure that older victims in your community are accessing the supports and services that they need? So something to think about. The conclusions of the study that Dana was talking about, which focused on the criminal justice response to stalking in Rhode Island, were basically that more education is needed. Law enforcement was not necessarily recognizing stalking, and when they did recognize it and charge it, prosecutors often dismissed it or reduced the charges. Why did that happen? Because they didn't think they could get a conviction. Why wouldn't they get a conviction? Because judges also can lack training on stalking. If everybody gets it except for the judge, the case is not going to go forward, or not going to be successful. So to quote a video that we use with our coordinated community response trainings, if there's one weak link in the chain, the whole thing is going to fall apart. So that's why it's so great that you guys are all here. You can help educate and spread the word about this crime. In addition to feeling that disclosure would not be beneficial to an older victim because they're not being taken seriously, many adults who were surveyed noted that they were themselves uncertain as to whether what they were experiencing was in fact stalking. They reported that they themselves minimized the perpetrator's behaviors. And part of that might be an unwillingness to want to admit that that's going on. They feel ashamed. There could be a lot of reasons for that, but maybe they themselves didn't even identify that that's what was happening. We've already discussed that older adults who reported in this study felt that nobody took them seriously, and so they didn't disclose additional instances of stalking. Maybe they tried to once, it didn't work, so they just decided they weren't going to try. In that way, Velva's story is the exception because she was persistent and she kept reaching out. Finally, one additional reason for non-disclosure of stalking being perpetrated against an older adult is that they're isolated. Whether that isolation is from friends and family or other support networks or supportive services, older adults and that level of isolation may inhibit or even prohibit an older adult from reporting stalking that's being perpetrated against them. We've got a couple more to talk about. Other reasons for non-disclosure of stalking for an older adult might be fear, fear of a loss of autonomy or independence, fear of losing the ability to make their own decisions, especially as we look at the concurrent, the existence of issues around mandatory reporting and ageism. Sometimes others assume an older adult is in need of rescuing or just needs a guardian or substitute decision making, when in fact all they really need is to have the stalking stop. That's the goal. They don't need a guardian. They don't need to go into some kind of assisted living facility. They just want that to stop. But that may be enough for them to decide I'm just going to suffer because I don't want. There may also be a deep concern if the perpetrator is a family member, a child or a grandchild, maybe a spouse or a partner or another caregiver. For older adults who are stalked by their children, it may be deeply shaming or concerning to engage the criminal justice system if the child is the perpetrator. We see that in all forms of elder abuse, and stalking is no different. Certainly with intimate partners or caregivers, the concerns might be related to safety as well as issues of independence and their ability to have their activities of daily living met. And finally on our list, but this certainly would not be last on the list for many older adults, is the issue of a lack of understanding the role of technology in stalking. So while older adults might be interacting with technology, they, like many others, might not fully understand the mechanisms and the means through which those forms of technology can be used against them. What's also interesting about the research we have is that in the case of older adults who are stalked, they are least likely to be aided by family and friends. And similarly, they are less likely to access effective services and supports to deal with the stalking. So if what this means is when older adults seeking support for stalking, they're looking to their friends and family, as one would do. And in that effort, they're less likely than other subpopulations to be helped by those individuals. That's just an upsetting dynamic. They're less likely than victims of other kinds of crimes to actually access any sources of support at all. So this information really speaks to the confounding impact of age in accessing effective services. Finally, in terms of the impact of stalking on older adults, I want to point out that what we know about elder abuse survivors, including victims of stalking in general, is that study after study and story after story that we hear shows that the experience of abuse dramatically increases the rate of morbidity and mortality for older victims. As you can see, elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation victims are 3 times more likely to die prematurely than non-abused older adults. That applies equally to older victims of stalking. I want to return to where we started in terms of thinking about whether you as service providers and advocates for older victims are working with older victims of stalking. And I'd be curious to read your comments if you're interested in sharing your thoughts in the chat box. Are you recognizing stalking as what it is and treating it as stalking? Additionally, if you're working with older adults who are being stalked and are treating stalking as just elder abuse more broadly, what are the issues that present themselves for older victims who might need assistance and support and interventions for the stalking that they experience? So is there a danger in labeling stalking as just elder abuse as opposed to thinking about some of the dynamics that Dana went over and labeling stalking as what it is? I think that all of these questions are important to think about and grapple with when you consider how you and your agencies are working with older victims, and when you think about the ways that you can enhance your services and supports for older victims of stalking. So I would invite you to share your thoughts on these questions in the chat box. And as you do that, I will hand things back over to Dana to talk a little bit about some of the resources and supports that are available to you now and after this webinar when you are working with older victims.
Right, great. Thanks so much. And I think that's such an important question in terms of, should we call it stalking and does it matter? You know, if someone's experiencing a terrible victimization, does it matter what we label it? But I see some folks are typing in now, so I'm definitely interested to hear your thoughts on that. Certainly our perspective at SPARC is that, yes, we do want to name stalking as stalking because for one thing, it can criminalize non-criminal behaviors and be charged separately. And it requires a different kind of safety planning because it's a major predictor, especially with intimate partner cases, of lethality. So we want to see that as a real red flag that there could be co-occurring physical violence there, in a way that if we just call it emotional abuse, not to minimize emotional abuse in any way, but if we don't label it as stalking, we might miss some of those. And also because it can be empowering for victims to just be able to name their experience and to realize that it's a crime and that there's a set of resources available and that other victims might be experiencing what they're going through. So that language of stalking can be really empowering. So again, I'm eager to see your thoughts as you're typing them in, but we would certainly say yes, it's important to name stalking for those reasons, and certainly more as well. So a few strategies and resources for addressing stalking. Big one is to advise disengagement, and that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if a stalker calls your victim 25 times, the victim picks up and says, I hate you, stop calling me. The next day, the stalker's calling 26 times because any contact was a win for them. That being said, we know that often victims do stay in touch with the perpetrator as part of their safety plan. And so it can be quite complicated, right? Because, a victim might call the stalker because then to kind of take their temperature, to know where they are. For a victim saying, yeah, I'd call him when he got off work at 2 a.m. because I could hear him drive home and get into his bed and fall asleep, so I knew he wouldn't come over and knock on my window. So it can be a form of safety planning, and we know that. So when you're working with victims, you want to do both. Advise disengagement and explain that any contact is a win, and let them know that you understand that sometimes that continued engagement may be necessary, and to be open with you about it so that you can discuss it with them and safety plan around that as well. Because sometimes victims hide that because they feel like, oh, my victim advocate said not to contact them, but then I did, and I did something bad. And so, of course, we want to talk to victims about that. Documentation is really critical, and in just a second I'll show you a documentation log that can help victims document it. Unfortunately, stalking is one of those rare crimes where it's committed, and then we tell the victim, oh, that sounds terrible, please go back, wait till it happens again, write it all down, and come back to us. And they almost have to build their own case, which is really, really unfair and really unfortunate. But because stalking by definition is a pattern of behavior, they need to document all the things going on in that case, both on their own criminal and things that on their own are not criminal. And of course, connecting them with safety needs and support services. And those can be very similar or very different from what they might need for response to elder abuse or domestic violence, depending on the stalking situation. One strategy I did want to highlight really quickly, though, is that sometimes we hear people tell stalking victims to just change their number or to get off Facebook or something like that. So I just want to play that out for a second, that if, again, I'm stalking Ann, because that's what I do today, I guess. I'm stalking Ann, and I call her, and then eventually I get that number that says, that message that says, well, this number's disconnected. Am I going to be like, oh, I guess I won't stalk Ann anymore? No. In fact, I might escalate my behavior because I'm angry at her, and I'm just going to show up in person now because I know where she works. And so I don't really know like where you, I mean, I know you work at NCALL, but don't worry, Ann, I don't really know. But, so actually cutting off those avenues. Yeah, I know. I can understand. I'm sorry. But, so sometimes cutting off one point of access can actually escalate the behavior, and it probably won't stop the stalking. That being said, some victims might still say, okay, I don't care, I still want to change my phone number, and that's fine, but when you're safety planning, you want to give them those pros and cons because there can be some cons there. So I just wanted to call that out. Here is, as promised, the incident log. This is also available on our website. And so often, and Velva talked about, she wrote down everything, and we often hear stalking victims saying they brought in, 300 pages of all their notes, and law enforcement and as well as victim advocates don't have time to go through all that, right? And so we often tell victims, document what's going on. We don't actually tell them what to document or what information we need. So here's a concise way to do that. Stalking almost definitionally crosses jurisdictions, right, because it's following someone often and contacting them. And most victims don't understand jurisdiction. So they'll become very frustrated, understandably, when they say, I reported this last week to the police, and how do you not have a record of it, not realizing that that was in a different county or whatever. If you ask who they reported it to, it'll be like, it was a white guy with a shaved head, so it doesn't help us, right? And so here's a way to keep track of all of the incidents. And you can adapt it as needed for your community. The only thing that we don't like to add in there is the emotion, how it made the victim feel, and that's because if they do decide to prosecute this case through the chain of evidence, the perpetrator can end up with this stalking log, and they might read, you know, I didn't mind when he called me, but when he showed up on the grandkids' school, it really upset me. And so if he gets that, then what's the next thing he's going to do? He's going to show up at the grandkids' school. So we don't want to educate stalkers on being better stalkers. That's why that's left off here. But and this is available, like I said, on our website, and I'll send a link to it in a second. There is an assessment, a lethality assessment specifically for stalking, and it is free to use, which is very exciting. It's called SHARP, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. Like Anne shared, there is a huge co-occurrence of stalking and violence, as well as with stalking and femicide. In over 7 out of 10 completed femicides, there was stalking before that. So stalking should be a major red flag that there could be physical violence as well as actual murder. And yet a lot of our lethality assessments ask very few, if any, questions specific to stalking. And so this is one that can be used either for intimate or non-intimate partner stalking. It's at coercivecontrol.org, which is written here at the bottom, and I'll link to it in a second. And if you go through this, it's a little long, so it's not good for a responding officer. It's something that you'd want to do when you have a little bit more time. I believe it's 43 questions. And it will pull out a narrative report as well as some safety planning tools. Now, of course, the safety planning doesn't replace the individualized safety planning that you want to do as a victim advocate. They're the experts on that. But it can give you a helpful starting point. And we've seen this used a lot of really creative ways. It could be in a for setting bail or bond. It could be for a protective order. It's just a way to make something that looks a little bit more quantitative in describing how the stalking is impacting the victim and the impact that it might have. So just something to consider. And also, when you go through it, you can check that you're just testing it out. If you'd like to look at it before you're actually sitting across from a victim using it, can certainly understand that, and so can the creators of SHARP. And so you can just say, I'm just testing it out and just see what it is. So again, free and easy to use. So I really recommend you use that for any stalking cases that might come through your door. Of course, the greatest resource, everyone's new favorite website, stalkingawareness.org, the website of my organization, includes the documentation log I just mentioned, information and fact sheets, safety planning tips. Again, of course, not replacing victim advocates, but providing some suggestions and resources for victims, service providers, and law enforcement, as well as Stalking Awareness Month materials. There's also a particular resource I want to highlight that's a checklist for DV and SA organizations that just asks you to think about how you serve and address victims of stalking. So it'll ask questions like, does the word stalking appear on your website? And is this in your mission statement? And do you have a protocol for which victims of stalking you serve or don't? So I'll send a link to that. That's on our website, again, under victim service provider resources. But it's something I really encourage you to do as part of your Stalking Awareness Month efforts. And, of course, also follow us. Our handle is at @followuslegally. If you get our 6 sense of humor, it's SPARC. If not, I'm sorry. I'm sure it was a long hour and a half for you. But we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter. Victim Connect is the closest thing we have to a national hotline on stalking. There is no national hotline on stalking in the U.S., unfortunately. So if you're not sure where to send the victim, they serve all victims of crimes and help refer them to local resources. So that's a great number to give victims. Don't give them the SPARC number because we will just be nice and tell them to call Victim Connect. So that's kind of a lose-lose. So that's the one to know. We're based out of Equitas, which is great resources for prosecutors working on any crimes against women, including stalking. So definitely reach out if you're working a stalking case or know someone who is. I'll hand it back to Anne to talk through NCALL a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you. Good resources. I would definitely invite you guys to check out the NCALL website. We have resources for survivors, for allies, for professionals and trainers, as well as for OVW grantees, including articles, webinars, PowerPoint slides you can use if you're doing presentations, training materials, self-assessment workbooks. One thing I really want to highlight for you guys is that we have just recently put out a series of educational modules for advocates, which are formatted as videos. Each is less than 35 minutes in length on each topic, and each one comes with a worksheet that contains links to resources and questions for advocates and programs to think about as they incorporate that content into their practice. So I invite you to check out our website, sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Check out our YouTube channel, which also has videos on some of these topics. And we also have, if I didn't mention it, a newsletter you can sign up with for through our website. I want to thank you guys. I also want to thank Sarah Meyer, who is on the webinar and who formatted our slides for us and made everything look pretty. And let's see, thank NCJ, FCJ for hosting us. Also ask that you guys complete the evaluation, which is going to pop up at the end of the webinar. So there are resources that folks have been typing into the chat box. You can, before the webinar ends, you can select and copy it if you want to paste that into a separate document, because it's all going to disappear in a minute. But that's all I've got. Dana, is there any last word you want to offer? Thank you so much for all your contributions.
No, thank you so much. It was a pleasure co-presenting this with you, and I know we're out of time mostly because I talk too much, so sorry about that. Thanks for sticking with us. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to learn more about this essential topic. You're the ones out there really helping and supporting survivors and holding offenders accountable. It's so essential. Stalking is something we really don't talk about enough, so I truly, truly appreciate the work that you're doing and that you took the time and that NCALL also reached out to initiate this webinar on this topic. So please visit our website, reach out. We can offer more trainings or anything else that you need to improve your response to stalking. So I hope this is the first time you're hearing from me and not the last. So please do feel free to reach out. And thank you so much, NCJFJ, for hosting the webinar and for everyone taking the time to be a part of it today.
Everybody.